And so we're meeting for 60 minutes and going chapter by chapter through Steiner's philosophy of freedom. I'm working from this beautiful 150th anniversary edition put out by Steiner Press in 2011, translated by Michael Wilson. There's some other translations out there. I like this one. They're all pretty similar. Each session, we will have a brief introduction and then just have open discussion. As we mentioned in the email that went around to the group, we're going to try to stay as close to the text as possible. We encourage and invite everyone to share their impressions and their reflections on the text, but try to keep it relevant. And the reason for that is that Steiner wrote this text as a kind of meditative exercise, a spiritual exercise to transform us, right? And when you engage in a study of this text, keep that in mind. It's an attempt to direct us to an experience at the very core of our souls, of our own thinking activity, and from there to discover what it might mean to be free, to be a free being, to be a free individual. But the best way to discover that is together in community, right? We are individuals in community, and we can only really be in community and be truly social beings if we've discovered this individual freedom, right? That's, I think, one way of looking at the proposal Steiner is laying out for us in this text. So I'll just say a few things about the prefaces, and Ashton might want to follow up and add anything I leave out, and then we'll just open it up for discussion. There's so many of us that I think if we did introduce one another to each other in this session, that would take up probably more than an hour. So you'll see the Volley link that I sent out. Volley is this app webpage where you can upload brief little videos. Some of you have already introduced yourself there. That's great. I encourage you to do that. Maybe, hey, Ashton, could you drop the link in the chat to that? All right. So as I mentioned, this is Michael Wilson's translation. And in his foreword, he makes a few important statements about translation choices. Keep those in mind. There are certain terms in German that have no exact translation into English, like Geist, for example, Zelle. Forgive my German pronunciation, Angus in particular. There might be other German speakers in here, but freedom, the very title of this book, the first English translation in the 1920s, Steiner actually recommended that it not be titled Philosophy of Freedom, because English-speaking people tend to hear freedom with a political connotation, having to do with our rights. And Steiner really was intending, with the German Freiheit, to point to something spiritual, a spiritual activity, a spiritual freedom. And so he suggested philosophy of spiritual activity. But in this translation, they've gone back to the philosophy of freedom 100 years later, because Michael Wilson believes that as time has passed, English speakers have become perhaps more capable of recognizing what Steiner meant with this term. Yeah, so do pay attention to his notes on each of these words and his translation choices. He also says that this text could be rewritten out of the English philosophical tradition in an English style or idiom, but that he has not tried to do that. He's sticking to as literal a translation as he can manage, but he said it would be an excellent idea to rewrite this text out of the English philosophical tradition. I would say Steiner wrote the philosophy of freedom out of the German idealist tradition. So he's writing this text after a deep study of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Goethe, of course. If it were to be rewritten out of the English philosophical tradition, it would perhaps take a slightly less idealistic form, and might be, you could easily rewrite this from the perspective of, say, Charles Saunders Peirce and William James. I know there are some here who might disagree with me, but I think it would be possible to bring a anthroposophical approach out of the soil of the English language, as it were, in the same way that Steiner has brought it out of the German language. The point is not what words we use, but the meaning of the words and how we translate that into our own experience, right? Michael Wilson says it would be an excellent idea to rewrite this book out of the English philosophical tradition. That's such an enticing and overwhelming suggestion on his part that really struck me. So I'll leave that and move on from Wilson's foreword to just say a few things about Steiner's preface. He says he's trying to answer two fundamental questions, right? The first has to do with human nature. He's endeavoring to articulate a kind of philosophical anthropology, right? And the second question has to do with human freedom and what region of the soul that freedom unfolds in and how we might be able to discover it for ourselves. The only other thing I want to mention about Steiner's prefaces is that this book was first published in 1894 and republished in German in 1918. It went out of print after the first publication. I think that's significant. Steiner was disappointed that some of his teachers and colleagues, he was a rising star in the German academic world at this time. Some of his teachers and colleagues who he was trying to influence with this book, von Hartmann, chief among them, they didn't get it. It fell on deaf ears, he says. And yet 25 years later, he wanted to reissue it, both to attempt to reach those of a more natural scientific mindset, but also at this point, anthroposophy, the Anthroposophic Society was up and running. He wanted to reach people who were attempting to engage in spiritual scientific research, to remind them of the origins of this type of work and the doorway through which one must pass in order to gain true knowledge of the spiritual world. And he's trying to describe that doorway in this book. But he also says that one does not need to take seriously all of his esoteric research about spiritual beings and hierarchies and so on in order to take what he's doing in this book seriously. It's the doorway to that world. It opens up a form of intuitive perception and thinking capacity that can transform one's life, and one needn't go further than that. But it is a doorway one can also walk through into the type of spiritual research that he referred to as anthroposophy. So I'll stop there. Is there anything you wanted to add, Ashton?
Sure, yeah, just briefly. So, in connection with what you were just saying, the way that Steiner gets at these two questions, is there a view of essential human nature that could serve as a foundation for knowledge, like a foundation for truth? And, in connection with that, are we free? Which is a kind of horrifying question, if you're really asking the question in a serious way. But that he says, open-minded consideration of the two questions leads to the view that we live in the midst of a genuine spiritual world. So as Matt was saying, this is a kind of, and as Steiner says, for him, the means of laying a foundation for taking such a claim seriously, and also the foundations for building, subsequent spiritual research, that for Steiner unfolded in the whole sort of anthroposophical lecture cycle and text. But as Matt mentioned, he says that the philosophy of freedom itself can stand independent of it while also being intimately connected with it. And so, and then also one thing I wanted to mention was that in his introduction to the edition that we're reading from, Matthew Barton quotes Steiner saying that his primary intention for the text was to have the reader engage his or her thinking activity on every page. So, as Matt also mentioned in his introduction, the text is meant to be a kind of transformative impetus or spiritual exercise. And he also describes it as a kind of musical score. So I think you could, also describe it as a catalytic text to, at least the intention is to engage the reader in a wakeful, active thinking. And that is what puts us in touch, perhaps, with this essential nature of the human being that, for Steiner, becomes the foundation for an experience of truth and a kind of solid knowledge, but one that's always sort of contextual, especially when it comes to moral action and freedom motivated by ideals. And so freedom in this text, and that was sort of that Matt was speaking to the complexity of that word. He thought that English speakers had the tendency to just assume that we were already free, whereas the freedom that's being pointed to or is, I guess, he seeks to inculcate in the reader is a kind of inner freedom, so that today we're not inclined to act or to just believe things, but we have to individually know them to really get on board with things. And I think that's all. And one other thing was that in the notes on translation by Michael Wilson, I just thought, and this was something I mentioned in the little video that Matt and I made, he ends by saying, "It was the late Friedrich Guter who showed me, together with many others, the importance of this book as a basis for the social as well as the intellectual life of today." And I just thought that was an important thing to emphasize too, just to the extent that, this book seeks to induce in the reader a living participation in thinking, which can guide us as individuals. I think that's so important today in the political context of mob mentality and what have you. And it reminds me of this mantra that Steiner gave. It goes something like, in thinking, I experience myself united with the stream of cosmic existence. So that's kind of the way that thinking is being approached here. And then one thing about the just weekly being streamed on YouTube. If you don't feel like being on Zoom, you can also participate just via the chat on YouTube. So that was just one thing I thought to mention as well. And I think now we can just open it up for discussion. Josh?
Hey, it's good to be here and see everybody. This is fantastic. This big group of people. As I mentioned with the last book that we read, The Riddles of Philosophy, this is my first real exposure to Steiner's works. And just in his preface, some things really stuck out to me that I thought I would just bring up and see what other people thought of. But as Matt and Ashton mentioned, those two problems that Steiner brings up in the beginning that he wants to answer, or at least provide some foundation of a way that we can have knowledge of the truth to perhaps answers these questions. Anyway, like there's a passage I'd like to read that stuck out that's later in the preface, and it says the answer given to the two problems will not be of the purely theoretical sort which, once mastered, may be carried out as a conviction preserved by memory. Such an answer would, for the whole manner of thinking on which the book is based, be no real answer at all. So it kind of makes me think about that what we're gonna delve into is not the sort of type of metaphysics that pervades the modern mind, where it's like sort of the sovereignty of the calculable, as you know, the sort of modern metaphysics, if you could even call it that. So this seems really exciting to me, that I don't think he's advocating a sort of like purely pluralistic idea of, you know, that there is no difference between good and evil or truth or untruth. You know, I think at least I take that he's actually searching for an answer to realize through, you know, spiritual experience, a sort of philosophical way of life, perhaps, that would help us understand that while the world, or while the ideas of, you know, beauty or truth or justice can't be completely pluralistic, but yet there's no real, you know, ready answer for every instance, but yet we can perhaps truly know the difference between what is good and bad, you know, and be able to, like, you know, make political decisions based on that, or whatever have you. I don't know, but it's pretty exciting just reading passages like that in the preface.
Right. That's awesome, Josh. An important point, which I could summarize as just there's no formula that will be the same for everyone that would tell us what's true and false, what's good and evil. He's trying to teach us the method to discover as individuals a way of making such judgments, right? Rooted in our own freedom, the freedom of our own thinking, not a formula, an experience, right? That will be unique for each of us, but that nonetheless leads us to a realm of ideas, a spiritual world that we all share, right? But we have to find that world, access to that world individually, right? So it's paradoxical when you articulate it, but hopefully it makes sense. I see two hands, and Jeff, you're first on my screen. Go ahead.
Thank you. As I mentioned in my little volley video before this morning, before this is extraordinarily exciting to me. I've never read this book in a group, but I read it every spring. And once I tried to rewrite it, that didn't go very well. So I read it backwards instead, and that was quite an experience I would recommend. Is it Justin? Is that right? Justin just spoke. Is that right?
Josh.
Sorry, Josh. I think you nailed it. I can't wait till we get to chapter 12, and we're dealing with what moral imagination is, and Darwin. I want to just suggest that we look at the terminology that so have agreed upon terms that Michael Wilson puts forward in this in the translator's introduction. It's a chapter in and of itself, in my opinion, and I think Steiner would have written that chapter if he knew the English language, say, for the English translation. But it's a powerful introduction. and the key terminology, the linchpin terminologies are really laid out beautifully there and meaningfully, and I think would help us a lot if we were starting on terminological ground that we had a mutual sort of basic foundational understanding of. It's just a suggestion. I think in the volley, I said if philosophy of freedom is the Beatles, then Michael Wilson is the fifth Beatle.
Thanks, Jeff. Go ahead, Teresa.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, it's great to be here. Yeah, so I just wanted to see if it was appropriate to chime in early. And I have a feeling that probably with these questions of that Steiner's put forward in his 1918 preface about understanding human nature and how to serve our human experience, as well as exploring if we as a human can ascribe our own freedom and how we can do that and what can challenge us to do that. But yeah, the chiming in early bit was if it was appropriate for us as a group to suggest the next book, because I feel many questions will arise from how to explore this spiritual journey that Rudolf Steiner is putting forward. And so that the book, How to Know Higher Worlds, the classic guide to the spiritual journey, I think it's this one, whether we could perhaps look at reading that one after this one. Anyway, it's just a suggestion. Thank you.
I like it. I had a similar thought, so we'll revisit that as we go along. But at this point, I think that's a great suggestion.
Thanks, Matt.
Jeff, you're up.
Hello. I am going to, I guess, play off a little bit of the other Jeff's fifth Beatle idea and some of the other general introductory thoughts here. I think, I love both Steiner's prefaces, but also especially Michael Wilson's Translator's introduction, which we're talking about. I think I can say in general, some of my most elucidating reading in my life has been of Translator's introductions. You can almost just discard the rest of the book a lot of the time because you get the true essence in these Translator's introductions for all kinds of reasons that have already been touched on, like this, the difficulty of translation from one language to another, for the basic reason that where you have one word in one language, it's two or more words in the other, and vice versa. So especially when you're getting into such philosophical content as this, that's important, right? You can't just be loose with language, so you get this special problem of translation. But why I'm bringing this up particularly, as I say, Jeffrey and others have already talked about a lot of the value we're getting out of the Wilson introduction. But I'm also wondering if maybe this is an idea that might bear more fruit when we get into the second part of philosophy of freedom, the strictly moral considerations of the human being. If this whole business of language and translation and its challenges kind of gives us another window into one of the big pieces of what this book is about, which is that like in the terms of Steiner in this book, this zone of spiritual activity, this zone of thinking, or also of course the big word of intuition, which is this capacity we have to see a concept or to see a thought, right? It's not like this what's normally thought of as the subjective process that the subject thinks, the subject produces thoughts, but he turns that right upside down, which is that we we intuit or we see these thoughts. So anyways, what I'm trying to put all together with all of this is this idea of multilingualism, in the challenge of translation and all that. It's all, and Matt, what you picked up on, this idea that perhaps even there should be a totally new version written out of the English philosophical tradition, which would be quite a project, as you said. But yeah, this whole idea of multilingualism really gets us, I think, to the heart of this book in a lot of ways, which is that our language, our process of thinking, our intuition, our ability to see very clearly and very distinctly different ideas, we can get better through more than one language, right? This I'm not very multilingual myself. I bear acquaintance with some other languages, but yeah, to the degree that we all kind of are aware of that, where somebody can, who is multilingual, will often flow in a conversation from one language to another because what they have to say next is better expressed in the other language, right? So there's that as a general thing. But why I said, and this is my point, I'm finally wrapping it up here, why I think this might all bear fruit more in the second part of the book, I think this becomes part of the foundation for freedom, in that we can get past our external conditioning, whether that's our cultural conditioning, we have other sources of outer authority, our parents tell us to do this, or culture tells us to do that, or whatever. Our mother tongue, in that sense, becomes this basis of authority if we don't properly engage with it through the activity of thinking to understand the language we've come from, and how that can be a limit if we don't kind of get more into that zone of freedom. So anyways, all of that and much more is kind of in that Wilson translator's introduction. But as I'm saying, let's, anyone who wants to join me in that, see if more of that thought bears out in the second part of the book.
Thanks, Jeff. Important points. Speaking of the multilingual, Angus, I see your hand. Go for it.
Hi, evening all. Lovely to be here. Such a big group. I was actually going to get a little bit nerdy on language straight away. There are two keywords that I'd just like to share with the group, and then suggest that there's perhaps, if there are other people interested specifically in this language bit, there might be a possibility of doing a separate video to talk more in depth, because what I hope to show, so very, very quickly, is how you might approach these key ideas. I'm actually going to share my screen with you. So one of the key words in the philosophy of freedom is erkennen and Erkenntnis. And if you and just find that, I think you can see my screen, yeah? Yeah. So what you've got here is you've got all the different erkennen, which is what Wilson translates with to cognize. This is really what it means for a German, all rolled into one: to realize, to recognize, to discern, to perceive, identify, to detect. Now, I don't want people to think about it in terms of I've got to learn that list, but it's the flexibility around that word that is needed. And then the word Erkenntnis, which is the noun of the verb erkennen, similarly has these these multiple nuances which cognize just doesn't cut. But that you don't have to know German to nevertheless to teach yourself to view it with a wider angle lens, if I could express it like that, with simple tools like this. I'm on dict.cc. So that's one tool I'd like to talk about. The other one is, I'm going to just go to, no, in actual fact, I'll go to, so another word is Wahrnehmung, which means perception. And Wahrnehmen means to perceive. And this is another way of tackling language, especially a foreign language you don't understand, is if you can work out the etymology, so what it's made up of. And this Wahrnehmen, which is crucial in the whole of the philosophy of freedom, is built up of two words: wahr, which means true, and then Nehmen, which means to take. I'll just swap that around. So when a German talks about perceiving something, it's not just inbuilt in this idea. It's not just Wilson translates it with perceive, which is an ample translation, but it's also interesting, good to bear in mind what it means, a fuller meaning can be for a German speaker. Again, not so that you learn German, but you're actually broadening your mind in English when you broaden these concepts. So I just need to unshare my screen there. That was one point that I would wanted to share with you. Another one, several, but there's lots of people that want to speak. But another important thing that I'd like to bring up is this book here by a guy called Sergei Prokofiev, a Russian guy. It's called Anthroposophy and the Philosophy of Freedom. Now, especially if you're coming from an anthroposophical as opposed from a philosophical tradition, then this is a fantastic book for mapping what you might have learned from the anthroposophical spiritual science tradition, that links it back, shows how, when we come to chapter 3, we're going to be looking at something called the exceptional state. And this is such a key concept to first understand and then begin to find it in this soul experience. Steiner talks about us needing to discover each and every one for ourselves. And this book is a wonderful companion if you're serious about that part of the process. So I'll just, where's my camera there? You can see it there. Okay, I'll share the details in the chat. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angus. Could you drop that website you were showing us as well into the chat? I'd love to play around with that. Very helpful. Stuart, go for it.
Yeah, hopefully I'll finally start getting on volley. Certainly things I want to say about the concept of freedom, its relationship to the concept of, in English, free will and the free person, and that idea of being able to make a choice, or a phrase I've actually never seen in any discussion of free will. It's probably out there, but I haven't seen it. It is the ability to initiate an action. So I'm curious about how all those concepts relate to each other. But in the meantime, I just wanted to raise a question for the group to help me out on this. It's a problem I've been feeling for a long time in reading Steiner, which is the question of what's the relationship between the concept of the spirit. Spirituality has a lot of apparent meanings, but this idea of the spiritual world versus the world of consciousness, the relationship between spirit or spirituality and consciousness. I feel like I'm pretty clear, albeit indefinable, what consciousness is, because that's what I am, I think, as far as I can tell. But I'm not sure how the concept of spirit relates to that. And of course, that we have concepts like matter and so forth. But spiritual in the context of Steiner, again, my question is, how does that relate to consciousness? If anyone has any ability to help me on that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Stuart. And I'll note it, and we can certainly come back to that. Spirit and consciousness. Sarah, you're up next.
You're talking to me?
Oops.
Republican.
I'm gonna mute Julie there. I don't think she realized she got unmuted. Sarah, go ahead.
I'm just really into this final sentence in the, I guess, the original preface, that one must be able to confront an idea and experience it. Otherwise, one will fall into its bondage. And it just has me thinking a lot about what comes later in Adorno with the negative dialectics, or this concept of negative liberty. And I'd love to just go later, you know, in our readings more into this kind of paradox or like shadow side of agency, or kind of this foundation of liberal politics. And it kind of seems like in here, there's a question, you know, that the confrontation and the experience of the, of the idea itself, in a sense, is its manifestation, right? So I struggle with, I guess, this dialectic between freedom and bondage here. And I'm hearing a lot of maybe his influences from the Yoga Sutras, or maybe even kind of like a Zen-based philosophy that's being hinted at. But I'm just really fascinated by the confrontation and experience of the idea itself as being freedom, because I feel that can be easily argued, or it can just be, it could be either. It could be this Zen, like a happiness and slavery kind of concept, right? Like, I think it's written elsewhere in the prefaces, or maybe before that, of really just being able to exist at your best, at your most balanced or peaceful in the worst situation that you could be in. But yeah, just that kind of negative dialectic there, or the sacred relationship between liberty and bondage, and kind of how we're seeing that manifest now, this self-agency, this liberalism that in a sense is really wrapped up within the material world in a way that it was originally, it seemed like it was trying to free itself from.
Yeah, good points, Sarah. I mean, it's inevitable that the social and political implications of this text will surface as we move forward, just given the times we live in. And I mean, the times Steiner lived in and died in too early, or perhaps not. You know, we all have our karma. But yeah, negative freedom versus positive freedom, I think, is an important distinction to make. And that, again, in the American context, we tend to think of freedom in terms of negative freedom, like don't tread on me, leave me alone. Or as Ashton said, because we assume we're already free, we just lose our freedom when the government or whoever imposes upon us. And Steiner's trying to say that we actually need to cultivate our own consciousness and thinking capacity in order to become free, even if we already have negative freedom. Even if we don't have negative freedom from, we could be in prison and practice what Steiner is trying to teach us here, right? So Lorenzo, you're up next.
Yep. Just a tentative answer to Stuart's question, which I think the difference between spiritualism, in the sense that Steiner is trying to give us, and just the realm of conscience and consciousness, and the realm of ideas, well, can be summed up with the idea of solipsism. Because if you just let's say get rid of naive realism and look at the realm of consciousness and all the ideas that are available to the ego, then you don't get the participation that Steiner is for. And I think that's what he means with the spirituality here as opposed to idealism. That's my guess, at least. Thanks.
If anyone wants to comment or ask a question, please feel free. Angus, your hand I see. I just wanted to reflect on the fact that, you know, we're reading the English translation, and obviously we all speak English in this group, and yet there are also native Italians. There are some Swedes, I believe, more than I know, but we have multiple languages present here, and as relevant as we're moving through this text. I mean, obviously we're working with Steiner, having written this in German, but, you know, as each of you feel it is relevant from your own mother tongues, please do share connotations and resonances with terms in your own, and the way that concepts get languaged in your own mother tongue, just to give us a broader sense of how it is that our language is connected to our concepts. There are some schools of thought that say that we could not think without language. And I think what Steiner's directing our attention to is that there's not an we shouldn't identify concepts and words or concepts with language, right? Even if language functions as a kind of scaffolding for our thinking activity, thinking is not reducible to language, right? But it remains true that different languages have more or less facility in articulating various concepts, right? So I just wanted to put that out there. Angus, go ahead. You are still muted, Angus.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to come back to what Sarah was saying. It's very interesting and relevant points. But the questions are, so the first question that's relevant to the point that Sarah was making is like, can we trust thinking? And this is a process that takes a long time to really get to grips with what is the question I'm asking myself here. Can I trust my thinking? So the question that Sarah asked, the questions that I ask, the questions that any of us asks, they are a product of our thinking. And Steiner, right at the beginning, is saying these first 7 chapters, the fundamental question is, can we trust our thinking? Now he ends up with a positive answer, but it's the process through there that's key. And it's extremely likely we're going to veer off in different directions in our conversation, but I think it is of value to remember that this is the key question in the first 7 chapters here. Can we trust thinking? Where can we trust thinking? And so I'm going to chuck something out there, and because Steiner will be telling us that thinking is beyond subject and object. Can you even conceive that? If you can, then that's great. But I know when I first confronted these ideas, and even after having read it several times, it was sort of like, what? And some of us have walked through that door and sort of feel that we have a decent handle on it, and other people here, they'll be confronting that question for the first time. But I think holding on to this question, it's having it constantly in the back of our mind. Can we trust thinking? What is thinking? Can I trust it? And it felt relevant to say it based on what Sarah's important contribution there. So thank you.
Thanks, Angus. That's a nice teaser, as it were, for the types of thoughts that will become possible for us. Subject and object as concepts, and thinking as beyond that. You could say thinking is the process, the activity by which we create concepts, and both subject and object are the excretions, the products of thinking activity, right? We're so used to thinking of thinking as a subjective process, and Steiner's saying, no, it puts us in touch with reality. And in fact, is the only way we can get in touch with reality. All right, hands are going up. Jonathan, you're up.
I'd just briefly like to mention something that really strikes me about this book, and it pertains to everything we've been speaking about, particularly the language.
Hey, Jonathan, do you have the right mic selected? It's really muffled.
Yeah, sorry, I've got real problems today with my equipment. I'll just speak a bit louder very briefly.
Okay.
But I would point people to the volley, because there's some quotes there from Steiner about this book. And the point that I'd just like to make that really strikes me is that it's in effect, it's a testament of his struggle and his journey. And so, necessarily it's written in his language and from his experience, and with the concepts and the ideas that he met that helped him to sort of make this passage through, to get to a place where he felt, there is something here that I can, this is new, I can give this back and report on this, and others, they may not take the exact same path. They may, if they're in English, they may write it in a completely different way. Their path to the same experience could be addressed in a completely different way, but nevertheless, I think the book is groundbreaking in the sense that it got to this point. I think it's worth going to spoilers and so forth at this point, because I think that's going to get anywhere. But just, it really strikes me how personal this book is, and it can help all of us, but it's not, this is such, and it's not a textbook. We can't get stuck on the language because it's very particular to him and his passage through. But it is a report that, like other testaments throughout history, can give us at least a clue or an idea, or say, look, there is this experience there, and I've come back and I can report about it, and it's with me, and it's helping me now. And I think that's what it's all about. It's this, in the preface, he's trying to show, it's not a theoretical sort of philosophical exposition, but he's trying to show a place, an experience that can be got to, which is then, it's not a sort of single outlet, like you can't capture it in a word and say that then the whole world is colored by that word or that language. But it's a possession, and he says it in the second preface in 1981, that it can then be with you for the rest of your lives, and it's this living freedom. So it's not an answer to this or an answer to that, but as Sarah was touching on, it's something that it isn't a positive or a negative freedom or anything like that. It's more something that is with you, that can help you at every point. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jonathan. It occurs to me that this is both an analogy, but also there's a contrast here. Those of you familiar with Carl Jung's Red Book, it's a kind of report of his descent into the underworld, the psychological unconscious, and his encounter with various beings there. And he tries to report this experience to his readers, and all of his, analytic psychology comes out of this experience he had where he thought he was losing his mind, right? Steiner's reporting his own efforts of striving to understand the nature of his own consciousness, but doing so in the full light of consciousness, different from Jung's descent into the unconscious, where it was almost, you could say, kind of almost automatic writing. I mean, I think Jung was recording what occurred to him after the fact, but it's an interesting analogy, but also a contrast, right, between what Jungian psychology was birthed out of, this experience recorded in the Red Book, and what anthroposophy is in some ways birthed out of Steiner's attempt to strive for this exceptional state, which he's reporting to us, so that we can then, following his footsteps, but again, each in our own way, we'll have to uncover what he discovered. Just occurred to me as you were speaking.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that and highlight that difference, because the sort of almost mystical Jungian passage was maybe a bit fraught and exciting and dangerous. And Steiner says, mine looks a bit dry at times, it has to be a bit dry, but it seems a lot safer in that sense. And maybe that's something that philosophy and that experience has afforded us.
Yeah, definitely. Teresa, you're up.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention, just on the back of Angus talking about how we can come to a point of trusting our thinking, and his comments on Sarah's contribution as well. For today, I've been working from Michael Lipson's translation of this text, the 1995 version. So forgive me, but my notes come from that version, but I will try and get the other copy that Matt, you're working from. So just linking to trusting our thinking, the notes I made on Michael Lipson's being the translator's introduction, it challenged me to redefine the word thinking. And so I'm just quoting on his introduction. He wrote, "We should recall that Steiner's goal was to stimulate the exercise of a thinking independent not only from words, but from the physical body and brain." And then that leads to a few notes I made from Gertrude Reef Hughes' introduction to this text, where she talks about intuition, and then she says, "Intuition knows without arguments, demonstrations, or others' discursive means." And she quotes Steiner in saying, "The essence of thinking can be grasped only through intuition." So that leads to my thoughts on how the group will consider. So if we're redefining thinking, and thinking is connected to intuition, how do we individually develop this intuition? Is it through meditation? And how do we develop this intuition gently and have a nice time about it? Thank you.
I mean, in some sense, I think this text is an instruction manual for doing precisely that, right? So we often, I'm trying to think of another word that is not an intuitive form of thinking, reflecting, representing, where, our mental pictures just come to us out of habits of association. And in Steiner's terms, that's not really the kind of thinking that he's trying to direct our attention to and allow us to consciously cultivate. Most of us, most of the time, are just allowing language to do our thinking for us, repeating cliches and so on, right? And yeah, Steiner's trying to direct our attention to a more inward process before and beneath that, right? And inevitably, to communicate what we discover there, we need to use language, but we can do so in a more flexible way than we would otherwise be able to once we've experienced intuitive thinking. David, I see your hand.
Yes. So on the question of the limits of thought, I think, like thought is a computational process and it is limited. And even like anything expressible is structured. Actually, like, I don't know exactly why, but anything expressible is structured. Language is limited as well. From idea, we get idea, but we're always in the realm of idea. I don't know, maybe some, like, I'm not sure if there's an assumption that idea is like metaphysical or can penetrate outside of this like space-time instance. I don't know, maybe. But so there's a limit of thought, but that insight, whatever insight is, I think is something that might be able to go underneath that. But then when it bubbles up into thought, it's already like structurally limited. Anything expressible is like even the most insane, unhinged, like mentally distraught state is still structured. Like even chaos is ordered. Anyways, so I think there is limits to thought, and we shouldn't put too much weight on thought, but it's a useful instrument. So thank you.
There are modes of thought that can be computational, but I think thinking itself goes beyond that. I mean, that's the premise of this book. When we're engaged in exercises of like logical deduction, there's a sort of algorithmic process that's unfolding, and you could say, well, that's kind of computational, but where did the premises come from? The origination of a premise is not a computational process.
Yeah, that insight is not, but once the insight is had and is turned into a concrete datum, then it is, I think. Like once you see it and you've put it together, then you can work within a framework to like even maybe in the future, a computer can, like, once it has its axioms and its deduction rules, it can just generate all propositions that flow from like given assumptions. But that in that immediate moment of having that insight, like, can the computer do that?
I don't think so, but I'll be curious to see how this text affects your thinking on this subject as we move forward. Angus, go ahead, and then we're at the top of the hour, so we'll wrap up.
Okay. I remembered to unmic straight away. I'm going to try and talk to Teresa's point, but it also speaks to what David was talking about. Already in the introduction, we were introduced to the difference between remembering thinking and intuitive thinking, and it's an important distinction to make. And as we move through this book, the more we actually think about our own thinking, the more we're going to get out of it. So the more we're able to recognize what David was talking to when it's just a remembered thought. But so what is intuitive thinking? I think all of us have had experiences of it. I know all of us have. The trouble is we often don't remember it. But I think I'm going to try and give an example here, which I think you'll probably recognize, which might give you a little bit of an idea. So think of any time in the past when you've been battling to understand a problem. And you've been battling, you might have been doing it for days, you might have been doing it for weeks, you might have been doing it for years. And then bang, one day it's there.
But is
Where
that
did it come from?
is that a linear?
David, my point is identify the characteristics. There is a remembering thinking, and then there is this intuitive. Your questions are relevant, but first of all, we have to create a clear landscape of how thinking lives in us. And the point that I'm trying to clarify here is that already in the introduction, we're being told, look, you've got remembering thinking and we've got intuitive thinking. We haven't come to that chapter where he describes that, but we have all had that experience. That's one thing I am confident of. And the more we can identify those examples in our own lives, and not Angus's lives or Robert's lives or Rory's lives or whoever it is that's speaking, but when we find it in ourselves, that's when this intensification of the thinking process is happening. That is when we are growing. That's when we're finding that region of the soul where we can answer the question, can we trust thinking?
I'm so glad this this tension is emerging in our first session here. I think very important question here, which is it's precisely what Steiner's trying to dig into. We need to wrap up. Ashton, did you have anything else you wanted to share before we finish? I had an idea to wrap up, but
no, just that we'll be reading the first chapter only for next week, so that's it.
okay. I'll send us off by reading from the preface to the first 1894 edition, where Steiner quotes Schiller. And I believe Schiller is here speaking to, he and Goethe had quite a friendship, and they each are representatives of different poles of reality. And so Schiller writes here, truth seek we both, thou in the life without thee and around, I in the heart within. By both can truth alike be found. The healthy eye can through the world the great creator track. The healthy heart is but the glass which gives creation back. So thank you so much for showing up for this this endeavor and for your contributions today. And I very much look forward to next week. If you haven't already, the link to the volley was shared in the chat at the beginning of our session. You can go introduce yourselves there and share any other thoughts which occur to you over the course of the week as you're reading. The volley got quite active during our last reading group, and I expect it will be even more so with this book. All right, everyone. Have a great week. See you next time.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Thanks, folks.
Everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.